The night was supposed to be filled with excitement and freedom. Just us three friends, a car full of snacks, and the thrill of an open road. My friends, Josh and Layla, were already singing along to the radio as I took the wheel, heading toward the remote campsite we'd been dreaming of visiting. We had heard stories of eerie things happening around these back roads, but we laughed it off, daring each other to be the first to flinch if anything weird happened. As the city lights faded in the rearview mirror, a strange sense of unease crept into the car. It wasn't anything tangible, just a faint whisper of something I couldn't quite shake. The road became narrower, the trees on either side thickening until they seemed like towering walls of darkness. A low mist slithered across the asphalt, swallowing the yellow lines in ghostly wisps. The only light came from our car's headlights, slicing through the shadows, revealing glimpses of twisted branches and dark shapes that vanished the moment they appeared. The GPS started glitching, instructing us to take turns that weren't even on the map. I chalked it up to poor signal, but each misdirection led us further into an unknown stretch of road I didn't recognize. "Hey, maybe it's a shortcut," Josh said, glancing back at me with a shrug, though I could see the tension in his face. He was trying to sound confident, but the atmosphere inside the car had shifted. The laughter and music had faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. Just when I was about to turn us around, the fog grew so dense it was like driving through a wall of cotton. I slowed down to a crawl, squinting to see just a few feet ahead, when suddenly a figure materialized in our headlights. A lone hitchhiker stood by the roadside, barely visible in the mist, his thumb extended in the universal gesture for a ride. He was wearing clothes that seemed out of place, like they belonged to another time. A weathered trench coat, worn-down boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. "Should we stop?" Layla whispered, her voice barely audible. There was something wrong about him, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But despite every instinct screaming at me to keep driving, I felt my foot easing off the gas. Josh gave me a look, half questioning, half pleading, and I shrugged, feeling a strange compulsion to pull over. The hitchhiker climbed into the back seat without a word, his movements slow and deliberate. As he settled in, he glanced at each of us, his eyes dark and unreadable like bottomless pits. His face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light, and his expression was a mask of cold indifference. He didn't say where he was going, just sat there, staring straight ahead. We continued down the road, the only sound the hum of the engine and the steady thump of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The hitchhiker remained silent, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I tried to focus on driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Beside me, Layla shifted uncomfortably, stealing glances at our silent passenger in the rearview mirror. Josh, always the brave one, tried to break the silence. "So where are you headed?" he asked, his voice a forced attempt at casualness. The hitchhiker turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Josh's with an intensity that made me shiver. "Home," he replied, his voice a hollow whisper that seemed to linger in the air long after he'd spoken. That one word sent a chill through the car, making my stomach drop. I didn't know why, but it felt like a warning, like he wasn't talking about any home we could understand. As we drove, the fog grew thicker, curling around the car like tendrils, almost as if it were alive. The trees outside seemed to press closer, their branches twisting into shapes that looked disturbingly human. My hands were shaking and I kept stealing glances in the mirror, half expecting the hitchhiker to disappear or transform into something else. Every time I looked, he was still there, staring straight ahead, his face blank and unchanging. Layla leaned over and whispered, "This doesn't feel right. Maybe we should let him out." I nodded, my mind racing as I looked for a place to pull over. But the road stretched endlessly before us and there were no turnoffs, no signs, nothing but the suffocating fog and the darkness pressing in from all sides. Just as I was about to say something, the hitchhiker leaned forward, his breath icy against the back of my neck. "Turn left at the next road," he whispered, his voice sending a shiver down my spine. I glanced at the GPS, but there was no left turn, no road at all. "There's no left turn here," I mumbled, my voice shaking. The hitchhiker's eyes met mine in the mirror, dark and hollow, and he repeated, "Turn left." Against every ounce of logic and survival instinct I had, I found myself slowing down and turning left. The car lurched onto a narrow, winding road that seemed to materialize out of nowhere, hidden by the fog. The moment we turned, the air grew colder, and the fog thickened, wrapping around the car like a shroud. Josh and Layla were silent, their faces pale with fear as they clutched their seats, their eyes darting to the hitchhiker. The road was rough, the gravel crunching under the tires as we wound our way through the dense trees. Shadows seemed to move just beyond the reach of the headlights, strange shapes flickering at the edge of my vision. I felt trapped, like we were driving deeper into a nightmare we couldn't escape from. The hitchhiker leaned forward again, his voice a hollow whisper. "I used to live here, you know." His words hung in the air, thick with an unsettling finality. He turned to look out the window, his gaze fixed on something far in the distance, something only he could see. "This place has a way of keeping you," he murmured, almost to himself. Josh shifted uneasily, glancing at me with wide eyes. I could see the question in his gaze. Why weren't we stopping? But every time I thought about pulling over, something held me back, a strange compulsion to keep going, as if the road itself wouldn't let us leave. The road finally ended in a clearing, revealing an old, crumbling house that seemed to rise out of the mist, like a ghostly apparition. The structure was barely standing, its walls leaning at odd angles, as if a slight breeze could knock it down. The hitchhiker's face softened, a hint of recognition flickering in his eyes. He motioned for me to stop, and despite every instinct telling me to keep going, I parked the car. Without a word, he stepped out and began walking toward the house. Josh, Layla, and I exchanged uneasy glances, each of us silently debating whether we should follow him. But something about the house held us in place, as if it were watching us, waiting for us to come closer. Against our better judgment, we climbed out of the car and trailed behind the hitchhiker, drawn by an unseen force. The air around the house was thick and cold, carrying the faint scent of decay. The porch creaked under our weight, each step sounding like a warning. The hitchhiker stopped in front of the door, his hand resting on the peeling wood. He turned to us, his eyes reflecting a deep, haunting sadness. "Welcome," he whispered, pushing the door open. Inside, the house was a time capsule of forgotten memories. Dust-covered furniture lay scattered around, and faded photographs lined the walls. The atmosphere was suffocating, pressing down on us as if the house itself resented our presence. The hitchhiker wandered through the rooms, his fingers tracing along the walls as if recalling a past life. A sense of dread washed over me. It was as if the house was alive, breathing, and we were intruders in its domain. I could hear faint whispers, just at the edge of hearing, like voices trapped within the walls. I looked at Josh and Layla, and from the expressions on their faces, I knew they felt it too. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of something deeply wrong. As we moved deeper into the house, I noticed a picture on the wall that stopped me in my tracks. It was an old, faded photo of a family standing in front of the very house we were in. My eyes widened as I realized the man in the picture was our hitchhiker, looking exactly as he did now, unchanged by time. My heart pounded as I pointed it out to Josh and Layla, who gasped in horror. The hitchhiker stood in front of us, watching our reactions with a solemn expression. "I told you," he said quietly. "This place has a way of keeping you." His gaze was distant, almost as if he were looking through us to a memory only he could see. "I've been here for so long, waiting for someone to bring me home." Layla took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. "What do you mean? Are you dead?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The hitchhiker didn't answer, his eyes hollow as he looked around the decaying house. "I lost my way," he said softly. And now, I can't leave. The realization hit us like a tidal wave. We weren't alone in this house. It was full of lost souls, trapped in a never-ending cycle, bound to the place they had once called home. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed Josh and Layla, my mind racing with the need to escape. But every room, every hallway seemed to lead us deeper into the house, twisting and turning like a maze. Desperation clawed at us as we tried to find the exit, our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. But every door we opened led us back to the same room, where the hitchhiker stood watching us with a sad smile. "You can't leave," he murmured, his voice blending with the whispers in the walls. "This place, it doesn't let go." I felt the walls closing in, the air thick with the weight of countless lost souls. The house was alive, feeding on our fear, binding us to it. I grabbed Layla's hand, my voice trembling as I shouted, "We have to keep trying. There has to be a way out." But every step we took seemed to lead us in circles, bringing us back to the hitchhiker and his haunted gaze. Just as I felt hope slipping away, Josh noticed a faint light coming from a crack in the wall. Desperately, we pried at the boards, tearing them away until a small opening appeared, revealing the misty woods outside. Without a second thought, we squeezed through, scrambling into the cold night air. The moment we stepped out, the house vanished, swallowed by the fog, as if it had never been there at all. Breathless, we stood in silence, the weight of what we'd just experienced pressing down on us. We stumbled back to the car, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the eerie silence filling the void where the hitchhiker's presence had been. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him sitting in the back seat again. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the fading mist. We never spoke of that night again, but it haunted our dreams, a constant reminder of the house that held its visitors captive, waiting for lost souls to bring it to life once more. And though we escaped, a part of us remained trapped in that place, forever entwined with the hitchhiker and his forgotten past. Jerry knew the desolate stretch of Highway 77 like the back of his hand. The road seemed infinite in its emptiness, broken only by the occasional flash of road signs that his headlights illuminated in the dead of night. The hum of his truck's engine and the steady line of asphalt beneath him created a rhythmic, almost hypnotic comfort. But all that changed when his CB radio unexpectedly crackled to life. A faint, desperate voice barely made it through the static, but Jerry caught a few words that made his blood run cold. "Is anyone there? Please, help," the voice pleaded, filled with desperation. He leaned closer to the radio, adjusting the dial to clear the signal. "This is Big Red, I hear you," he said, scanning the empty horizon. "What's your location? Do you need assistance?" The only response was static, fading in and out with a chilling urgency. For a moment, Jerry considered dismissing it as interference. But the voice returned, even more desperate. "Please, I'm trapped. I can't breathe." The voice was hollow, but unmistakably real, carrying an edge of fear that no amount of static could disguise. Despite every logical reason not to, Jerry felt compelled to help, something tugging at his gut that he couldn't shake. He checked his GPS, but there were no nearby service stations or signs of civilization for miles. The mystery of it gnawed at him, and so, against his better judgment, he took a deep breath and resolved to follow the signal wherever it led. Jerry pushed his truck onward, glancing repeatedly at his CB radio, as if the ghostly voice would somehow become clearer. Each mile seemed to plunge him deeper into a realm beyond the tangible world he knew. His GPS flickered, struggling to register his location as he drifted further into the night. The air grew colder, and his headlights revealed nothing but an unbroken stretch of road, lined with dense forest that loomed like silent, watchful giants. Suddenly, the radio crackled again. "Please, don't leave." The voice was fainter this time, but it held a desperation that chilled Jerry to the core. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling a gnawing dread. The voice seemed to lure him further, each call more agonized than the last. His mind raced, imagining all the scenarios that could have led someone to such a dire situation out here, in the middle of nowhere. Had there been an accident? Was someone left stranded, hoping against hope for a lifeline? Just then, Jerry's headlights caught a glint of metal on the side of the road. He slowed, pulling over to investigate. There, half buried in weeds, sat an old rusted car, the model ancient and coated in years of grime. He scanned his surroundings, but there was no sign of life, only the eerie quiet of the isolated road. Yet as he looked closer, he saw it. On the window of the old car was a faint handprint, smeared across the glass. Curiosity turned to dread as Jerry stepped out of his truck, flashlight in hand. The abandoned car seemed to breathe in the silence, an ominous reminder of something long forgotten. Its windows were caked with grime, and the paint had faded to a dull, ghostly shade. But there, on the back seat's worn leather, he noticed a message scratched into the fabric. "Help me." His heart raced and he took a step back, feeling a growing sense of unease. Who had left this car here, and why did it feel like it was calling out to him? The words seemed to stare back, pleading silently in the darkness. He scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement, but he was met with only the stillness of the night. Jerry returned to his truck, locking the doors as he sat in silence, the image of that message burning in his mind. But before he could fully process what he'd seen, the CB crackled to life once more. "Why did you leave? I'm still here, waiting." The voice was now closer, clearer, as if it were sitting right beside him. He slammed his hand on the steering wheel, muttering to himself, trying to shake off the unease. Yet as he looked into the mirror, he could have sworn he saw a shadow just behind him, lingering in the darkness of his cab. With trembling hands, Jerry accelerated, desperate to leave the haunted stretch of highway behind. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror repeatedly, but each time he saw only darkness. Yet an overwhelming sense of being watched gnawed at him. The voice returned, now cold, almost menacing. "You left me to die. How could you?" it demanded, each word laced with accusation. He tried to shake it off as his imagination, a product of exhaustion and the late hour, but it was becoming harder to convince himself of that. The CB radio seemed possessed, alive with static and the haunting voice that now spoke in broken fragments of memories. "I was waiting for you to come back. You promised." A chill crept down his spine. He had never promised anyone anything like that, but the voice continued, growing louder, filling his cab with an oppressive weight. Each mile brought him no closer to safety. The darkness outside seemed endless, wrapping around his truck like a shroud. The trees swayed ominously as if whispering secrets of their own. In a sudden burst of bravery, he shouted, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The CB was silent for a moment, but then it replied, chilling and clear. "I want what you owe me, Jerry, your life." The voice on the CB began telling Jerry things that made his skin crawl, details from a life he didn't remember, yet somehow felt chillingly familiar. It spoke of dark highways and broken promises, recounting tales of nights spent alone on the road, each story laced with pain and regret. Somehow these memories felt like his own, as though he'd lived them once, a lifetime ago. He shook his head, trying to stay focused, but each word struck a nerve, resonating within him in ways he couldn't explain. "Why didn't you help me when I needed you?" the voice accused, a haunting blend of sorrow and anger. Jerry's hands gripped the wheel, his knuckles white as he struggled to maintain control. Every instinct screamed for him to abandon the CB radio, to shut it off, but he was inexplicably drawn to the voice as if under some spell. As he drove, the air inside the cab grew colder, suffused with an energy that felt far from human. The voice faded briefly, replaced by an eerie silence, but Jerry knew it wasn't gone. He could feel it lingering, watching him, its presence a heavy shadow over him. Then, without warning, the voice whispered his name. "Jerry," in a tone so familiar it felt like a distant memory, twisted and distorted by time. As the sun began to rise, a faint glimmer of hope seeped through the horizon, but the voice was still with him, quieter but no less insistent. "There is no escaping what you've done, Jerry. You left me here, and now you will never be free." He knew he was trapped, his truck now an iron cage, haunted by a spirit tethered to him through miles and memories that weren't his own. The trees gave way to open road, yet Jerry's heart remained heavy. He was no longer sure if he was awake or lost in some twisted dream. The voice faded into silence, but its weight lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. His thoughts spiraled, memories blurring with fragments of a life he couldn't recall. As he drove on, the endless road stretched before him, bound to a fate he could no longer deny. Somewhere in the depths of his mind, he could still hear the voice, waiting, watching, reminding him that some promises once made could never be broken. And as he faded into the road's eternity, the silence was broken by a faint, distant call. "Help me." The engine's hum had always been comforting to Tom, especially on his late-night hauls. But this particular night was different. The air was thick with an uneasy stillness, the type that blankets you and seeps into your bones. Tom had been trucking along the empty highway, passing miles and miles of barren fields when he saw her, a figure on the side of the road, barely visible in the dim glow of his headlights. As he got closer, he could make out more of her details. A young woman in a tattered dress, her arms folded against the cold. She wasn't waving or signaling for a ride, just standing there, staring straight ahead. Against his better judgment, he slowed down and rolled down his window, calling out to her, "Need some help?" She didn't answer, just gave a slow nod. The unease gnawed at him, but he couldn't just leave her out there, miles from anything. He opened the passenger door, and she climbed in, her gaze still distant, as though she were seeing through him. Tom tried to break the silence, making small talk, asking her where she was headed. But the woman barely responded, offering only the faintest of nods or a whisper of acknowledgement. Her presence weighed heavily in the cab, her silence unnerving. Every now and then, he glanced over, half expecting her to vanish into thin air. The highway stretched on, with nothing but darkness and the occasional signpost flickering past. He noticed she was barefoot, her feet dirty and bruised. A chill ran down his spine, and he suddenly wished he'd left her on the roadside. But it was too late now. She was here, in his truck, and they had miles to go. As the drive continued, strange things began happening. The radio, which had been off, crackled to life, playing a distorted version of an old song he recognized but couldn't quite place. He reached to turn it off, but it flickered back on, louder this time. His GPS screen started glitching, jumping from one screen to another, showing him places he'd never seen. The woman didn't seem to notice any of it. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, her hands resting in her lap, fingers twitching slightly. He tried not to look at her, to focus on the road, but something about her made it impossible to ignore. She was too still, too quiet, as if she were waiting for something. That night, as he rested at a truck stop, he dreamt of her. She was standing by his truck, her face pale, her eyes empty, staring up at him as if asking for help. He jolted awake, his skin slick with sweat. The image of her face haunted him, lingering even as he tried to shake it off. It was just a dream, he told himself, just the lingering effects of a strange encounter. But when he went back to his truck, he found a small, dirty footprint on the passenger side floor. His blood ran cold. There was no way she'd been in his truck after he dropped her off, but the evidence was there, undeniable. He felt as if her presence was still with him, hovering just out of sight, watching. Days later, on a deserted stretch of highway, Tom saw her again, standing on the side of the road exactly where he'd first picked her up. He slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, fear twisting in his gut. But when he looked again, she was gone. Only the empty road stretched before him, silent and still. He realized then that he hadn't escaped her. Whatever she was, wherever she'd come from, she was with him now, a passenger bound to him, waiting for the right moment to appear again. The highway stretched on before him, but Tom knew he was never truly alone. Not anymore.